the famous Chazal Medrash that Vayechi is a Parsha Stuma. In terms of its paragraph structure, it's considered a sealed portion. What does it mean it's a sealed portion? So Rashi, if you take a look at the first Rashi, Loma Parsha Zu Stuma, Vishekevon Shenifta Yaakovinu, when Yaakovinu passed away, this is after being there 17 years, Nistamu Eineim V'liban Shalisho, Mitzoras Hashibo Sheschil L'Shabdam. The eyes and the hearts of the Yisrael, of Yaakov's family, became sealed, shut down. There was a level of becoming desensitized because of the shibud sheschil l'shabtam, because of the bondage which began. Now, factual, it says later that the actual bondage did not start till when? Until that whole generation passed away. So what's the shibud? What is the bondage which began the moment Yaakov passed away? That their eyes and the hearts were nistable, they were sealed. There was a certain level, a subliminal level of being desensitized when Yaakov passed away. So we'll talk about this in a moment. But let's say the Torah, the paragraph structure would have been a normal paragraph structure, not as a Parsha Stuma. Meaning it was so subliminal that they themselves didn't even realize that there was a slight difference between when Yaakov was alive and when he was no longer alive. The Torah reveals to me, or to us, they realized it, that due to Yaakov's passing at an infinitesimal level, at the most microscopic level, there was a change. They sensed the change. But unless the Torah writes it with this paragraph structure, we would have never known it. You'd say the bondage started later. No. Things don't happen in a moment. When change happens, when we speak about transition, something transitions. It's not a moment. It begins at a point, and gradually it happens. When did the process begin? It began with the passing of Yaakov. That was the beginning, the transition. It was so subliminal and something which, unless you were at that special level, you couldn't have detected that there was any change, because the actual difference happened when that whole generation passed away. So that was what the Torah is revealing to me, that although they were devout and they were at that special level and so on and so forth, nevertheless, the diminishment process began the moment Yaakov passed away. Now, I always mention the famous question, which the Maral of Prague asks. We find that, why did we go to Egypt? Because of the Bris Bein Absorim. Avram Avinu had asked the question, and all of a sudden, prophecy comes to him, which was a dread, which had tremendous fear. And Hashem says to him in this communication, Ger yeh zaracha be'eretz lo lahem, your children will be strangers in the land which is not theirs. Va'avodum, they will be enslaved. V'inu osam, they'll be afflicted. The nation that will enslave them will be judged. And then they will leave that bondage with great wealth. And it culminated with Egypt. But we were in Egypt only 210 years. But it says 400 years, right? So when do we begin calculating the 400 years? So Rashi over there cites the Midrash that the clock started to tick from the birth of Yitzchak. Because it says, Ger yeh zaracha. He said to Avram, your children will be strangers in the land, and the bondage and the affliction will start, and it will culminate after 400 years. And exactly 400 years to the minute, we left Egypt. Okay? That's the Midrash. So Maral of Prague asks, it says they will be enslaved, they will be afflicted. Where's the enslaved and where's the afflicted? How do you begin calculating those 400 years from the birth of Yitzchak? Factually, in the reality, real time, that wasn't what happened. That's the Maral of Prague's question. And the Gvur Hashem, so he answers, if a person is at that special level of spirituality, and you at that pristine level of purity, and you're exposed to an environment which represents the most extreme level of impurity because of paganism, because of human sacrifice, because of witchcraft, and because of abominable behavior. What is that to that spiritual person? It's worse than the most extreme level of physical affliction. It's the equivalent of death. Because the Avos HaKadoshim, they were so spiritually attuned, that was the beginning of the bondage. That was the affliction. They were enslaved. There was literally 24/7. There were issues to contend with that their spiritual level should not be diminished, tarnished, or compromised to any degree. This is the morale. I'm just explaining the morale with embellishment. What?
Why not then from Abraham?
No, wait. But that's what he says. Oh, good question. That's exactly what I'm going to explain right now. I'm going to explain that right now. Zaracha, but it says Zaracha. From the moment you have Zera, when you have progeny, that's when it starts. So I asked, Avram asked the question before Yitzchak was born, correct? The bris was before, it started from that moment. Okay? So this is the question I asked. So what I said was, and I asked that question this morning to myself when I was thinking about this. So what I thought was this: Yitzchak, every one of the Avos, do you realize, other than Avram Avinu, was a miracle child. Sarah was barren, and miraculously she had a child. At the age of 89, she became fertile. She regained her youth. Yitzchak was born. Yitzchak was born in the most level of purity of Kedusha. That was his essence. From his inception till his birth, it was pure till he finally came into existence. Where did Avram come from? Avram came from a background. His father was Terach. It was a pagan society. He initially was a pagan himself. He came to himself. So in terms of being able to deal with all those issues, Avram Avinu didn't experience paganism, all that, whatever it was, the way Yitzchak would have been affected. Yitzchak would have been affected differently. Yaakov, Rivka Imenu, she was barren for 20 years. She didn't have a child. She was married. She only conceived after 20 years. And Yaakov, in the womb already, was holy. Because as it says, she had this agitation. When she would walk by the Yeshiva Shem Ve'ever, all of a sudden she'd feel this jolt. So Yaakov, from his very inception, was holy. For him to be exposed to this is Golus. This environment, he has no relevance to it. And therefore Yaakov was Yaakov Ishtam Yoshev Oholim. He was the man that Torah was the only way he could deflect and create this insular environment. Let's take it further. He goes to Choron to take his wives. Im Lovan Garti Taimnitza Shamarti. Although I was with Lovan, which that environment is the antithesis of Kedusha, Taimnitza Shamarti, Lo Lamarti Masav Aroim. I did not learn from his evil ways. I had no relevance to him. It's like he didn't exist. He fathered 11 of his 12 children were born in Choron. His children were born in an absolute environment of purity, of Kedusha. Lavan had no relevance, not an iota of influence on his children. From the time they were conceived until they were born. And they were raised. Therefore, whatever Choron was, any of those environments, to them, this is Avodim Vinamosam. That's what it is. Based on who they are, in their level of purity, and the level of sensitivity, this was the most extreme level of Golus. That's Avodum Inuosam, that's affliction. We come to Egypt. This 210 years, this is the culmination of the 400 years. As what did Yaakov say to his children when the famine? Redu Shama, go down there. So Rashi cites the Midrash over there. Yaakov didn't even realize what he was saying. When he could have said L'chu, he could have said go. Why did he say Redu? Because the gematria, the numerical value of Redu is 210. 10 years. This is the beginning of what? Of the exile. When they came to Egypt. So why was it the exile? Because again, being exposed to that environment, which Egypt, remember we mentioned the Maral, the Yechezkel Hanovi refers to the Egyptians that they are the equivalent. It says their flesh is the flesh of donkeys. Besar chamor besorim. So what, the donkeys? The Egyptians are not donkeys. This was the height of civilization. So he explains the word chamor comes from the word chomer. Of all the 70 root nations, the nation which had the least relevance to spirituality, who was the most devoid of spirituality, were the Egyptians. As a result of that, we find they were the most advanced or the most steeped in witchcraft and promiscuity and in idolatry and every aspect of everything which was the most extreme, which was the antithesis of Kedusha. That's what the Egyptians were. That's what they were. So again, going there, what do we have to contend with? Again, it's the equivalent of Egypt and maybe worse, being there. This is the 210 years. And as long as Yaakov was alive, it was like we were in Choron. Im Lovan Garti, Tarbit Seshamat, Lomarti Masav Elohim. Had no relevance. It's like we weren't in Egypt. But the moment Yaakov passes away, the Torah reveals to us, Pasha Stuma. It starts, the subliminal negative effect begins. The eyes of the Jews were Nistamu B'nei Ashibud. The shutting down process began. And there was a certain level of insensitivity which was created because of that level of exposure. And ultimately, when the generation passed away, that's when they chose to stop circumcising themselves, and that's when they became truly they became pagans from that point onward. Okay, now.
So, right, I'm just a little confused, if you don't mind. Is the Rosh saying then that the slavery and affliction began at the time of Yitzchak's birth?
Correct.
So what happens when Yaakov dies? We're still in that time of slavery and affliction.
Yes.
What happened?
Wait 1 second. So what happens? What happens if you experience, because of your spiritual level of attunement, you experience this environment as enslaved, as afflicted? Fine. So that's the fulfillment of the decree, of the prophecy. What happens if you say, this is paradise? We want to be like the Egyptians. This is terrific. So that means you're not experiencing it as affliction, as being enslaved. You know what Hashem says now? But I said there has to be enslavement. There has to be affliction. So now we go from a spiritual enslavement to a physical enslavement. That's what happened. That's what, when they said, we no longer want to be circumcised, Hashem says, you know something? Until now, they treated you like princes. They revered you. Now, they will despise you and they will enslave you in the physical sense. Okay? So it comes out very interesting. So the Redu, which is 210, that began when Yaakov went there, because again, it was dealing with all the issues, like what he had to deal in Canaan, what he had to deal in Choron. But once Yaakov passes away, there's nobody to deflect it. It starts. So what I said, something very interesting. We once said, we quoted a Rambam in Hilchos Talmud Torah. The Rambam says, until when is one obligated to study Torah? Until you die. Until the last moment of your existence. Why? Because the Torah tells us you should study the Torah to retain it and not to forget it. The moment you stop studying, you begin forgetting. So since there's a prohibition to forget, therefore you must learn until the moment you die. That's the Rambam in the laws of Talmud Torah. So when we find there's a transition, there's a change. Initially, you don't even sense it. Well, the moment you stop studying, do you feel you're forgetting? In terms of your mind, the recall, instantaneous recall. But you know something? The Torah reveals that's not the reality. There is a subliminal, at a minimal level, the fading process begins. It begins. You don't even realize it. The example I always give, you have a puddle of water. In the morning, the sun comes up. By late afternoon, that puddle's not there any longer. Did you see the water evaporate? It didn't disappear in the moment, right? It's gradual. That's the way things fade out. That's one's memory. That's one impact, being exposed to certain environments. There's a gradual level of erosion that you don't even realize that you're being eroded. Whether it's spiritual, whether it's physical, whatever it may be. It's gradual. That's what happens. So as a result of that, you have to continuously study Torah. Okay? Because it's very interesting. What is the antidote to negative influence? So the moment you let the cat out of the bag, the cat's out of the bag, or you let the cat through the door, as long as you're studying Torah, you're deflecting all those influences. That's the antidote. What happens if you stop? The moment you stop, there's already a breach. Once there's a breach, it seeps in. Therefore, if it's Barasa Yotzira Barsa Torah Tavlin, if the Torah was created as the antidote, you have to study continuously. Because the moment you stop, you forget. Once you forget, you no longer have that antidote. It's like the antibiotic is starting to fade out in the system. So now you don't have the intensity to fight the bacteria. You have to have the continuous process of Torah within the person, the retention, to be able to deflect all that, the Yetzer Hara. That's the reason. It's identical, the same thing. So when Yaakov was alive, we were unaffected. The moment he passes away, the eyes and the hearts of Jews start shutting down. But it didn't reveal itself. In reality, it was a sensitivity level. The example I always give, the Gemara tells us in Psochim, we're going to have it later, that forgetting is a gift. Why is forgetting a gift? I mentioned this in the past. Because if a person would remember the moment a loved one passes away, and it would be exactly as he experienced it when it happened, and he'd live with that throughout his life, you couldn't survive the pain. You wouldn't be able to survive the emotional pain. So Hashem gave a gift to humanity called forgetting. What do you mean? Person recalls exactly his relationship with his father or his mother, and the moment the person went through whatever he went through, and the person passed away, and everything. But it's not the same. We say time heals. What's time healing? That's exactly what it's about. Time heals. As a result of that, there's a fading. So it's not only recollection, fact, it's much more than fact. It's how you touched. The way you touched, that touch is no longer there. That fades. You remember the fact if you have that kind of memory, but it's not the same. That's forgetting. You may recall the Torah, but unless you're engaged in the process, you're not in it. Therefore, you don't deflect the influence which is coming in from the outside. The Gemara says that when Moshe Rabbeinu broke the luchos and the letters floated heavenward, that represented Shikras HaTorah. Because of that, we forget the Torah. And therefore, we have to continuously learn it and review it and be involved in it. Otherwise, everything we'd study, we'd never forget. So I ask the question, why? Why did the breaking of the luchos, why did that cause the Shikras HaTorah, the forgetting of Torah? So what I had said in the past, Jay, I'm not sure if you remember this. This may have been your hiatus when you took off to go do your sabbatical. So what I said was, after we said Nasiv Nishma, until the Chet Egel, where did we revert back to? We reverted back to pre-sin of Adam. The Jews would have lived forever. Death was no longer part of our reality. Death was no longer applicable to Klal Yisrael, because we reverted back to pre-sin. We were called, the Gemara says, B'nai Kel Chai. We're the children of the Kel Chai. As Hashem's forever, we would have been forever. But what happens when we participate in the Chet Egel, whatever that sin was, we reverted back to post-sin. As a result of post-sin, we have relevance to death. If we went back to pre-sin, death has no relevance to us. So forgetting has no relevance to our existence. Once it has no relevance, therefore we remember forever. But once you have to have death, you have to have forgetting because there is death, now you have relevance to that forgetting. Fading has relevance. Therefore, you have to study continuously to be able to deflect, because now with post-sin, you have to deflect that post-sin. Because death and post-sin are synonymous one with the other.